Welcome to Chapter 1 of Interpersonal Communication. What this chapter really wants to do is introduce you to all the different concepts we'll be covering over the weeks. And it will be very brief, but don't worry, we'll get more in detail as we go along. Stephen Hawking reminds us that one of the basic rules of the universe is nothing is perfect. Perfection does not exist. Without imperfection, neither you nor I would exist. And this is true about our communication. There's no such thing as perfect communication. What works in one situation may not work in a second situation. We have to embrace that imperfection. We're going to talk about things through this chapter, and we're going to break it up into two sections. The first section you're watching now, and then it'll be about 20 minutes, and then you can watch the next section, or you can take a break, your choice. But what we want to cover in these two sections is we want to define interpersonal communication. We talk about the channels of communication. We want to talk about the communication models, the traits, principles, motivation, issues, all within communication. The importance of interpersonal communication. When we communicate well, we create desirable outcomes, such as positive emotions, satisfying relationships, and happy memories. That is a goal we all want in our interpersonal relationships, and we achieve this through the communication we use. It's not about the perfect words, but it's about relaying our emotions and our feelings so that way we can build better relationships. Defining communication. The book says the process which people use messages to generate meanings with across context, cultures, channels, and media. That is a good definition. I like it. It does encompass a lot, but I think we need to definitely talk about perspective taking, and we will. With channels of communication, I know we like to think about the primary ones. You know, the auditory, which is the voice that we use and the words we're choosing. The visual, which is the non-verbal body language that we utilize to communicate. But all of them tie in. Think about all 5 of senses, how a hug relates so much, a pat on the back, a strong handshake, how there's a connection formed through our tactile communication. As well as, what about our smell? Our smell certainly couldn't. Well, have you ever walked into a house where they've just made cookies? It smells like love. It smells like someone cares. As well as when you taste those cookies. There's all factors. So all 5 senses play into how we communicate. Beyond the senses, we now actually have computer-mediated communication, or CMC. And this actually started when we started utilizing phones, because it kind of replaced some of that face-to-face communication we had, though it is still carrying multiple messages, like our tone, how we speak, the language, the words we choose, that all is coming through. It's kind of changing it. And now we have computers, we have everything like Skype, our cell phones, where we're getting the visual images as well. And people like to think this breaks it down into 2 different categories. The hyper-personal model, which is that we relate much more information because we're using technology, we're using a filter. So we feel free to share more information. Or there's the possibility of reduced cues, where because we don't have proximity, because we don't have all the body language, because we're missing some of the senses, that it reduces the message that we send. In all honesty, I think there's both. You can have hyper-personal and reduced. And it all depends on how comfortable we are with the technology. And this all goes into what's called the cybernetics theory. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize that. That's just a little extra thrown in there. Now we have different communication models. We'll talk about 3 as the book does. We have the linear communication model. With the linear communication model, that's kind of what we're doing right now. I can't get feedback from you. Not initially. I'm sending out a message and it's not coming back to me. And this has the same components where you'll have a sender, you'll have noise, and you'll have a receiver, but you don't have as the feedback going on. Examples are podcasts, radio, or television. The other communication models are the interactional communication model and the transactional communication model. They both primarily use this diagram that you see here. What changes is the rapidness of the feedback between the two models. And for me, that's not really important that you know which is the transactional and which one's the interactional. What is important is that you understand, even when we're not communicating, when we are the listener or the receiver, we're sending feedback at such a rapid rate that communication's always ongoing. It might be looking away, it might be stepping back, it might be moving closer, that we're sending constant messages in our communication. And this will lead us eventually talking about the phenomenological aspect of communication, which is where we're trying to take the perspective of others. That's part of the feedback loop, is when I do something in a communication or when I'm talking to someone, my nonverbals automatically draws them into trying to think of, well, how's he receiving this message? What is he thinking? So that's the important part to take away between the interactional and transactional models. Now, communication model, they also draw from traditional communication. The phenomenological approach is from Edmund Husserl, and what he really wanted to talk about is that only through conscious attention to truth can be discovered. But in order to achieve this, we have to accept our biases. We have to set our biases aside. That as we're trying to take perspectives of the other person, we have to not think about how we think about them, but we have to just think about how they're perceiving us. So we get into a model of, instead of I, it, I, thou, where instead of we're thinking about a person as an it, we're thinking about them as ourselves. And this is kind of some advanced model that we will touch on from time to time when we talk about perspective taking. Hans Gadamer added to this with, we're part of the interpretation. Any attempt at interpretation, we are interpreting which has already been interpreted. In other words, if I'm telling you a story, I've already interpreted the story. So I put my spin on the story to tell you. And so you're not getting just the straight story, you're getting how I saw the story. So you're getting my perspective, and that becomes part of your perspective. So everything we already tell has been interpreted before. Defining interpersonal communication is a dynamic form of communication between two or more people in which the message exchange significantly influences thoughts, emotions, behavior, and relationships. This takes that initial book definition and adds value to it, because how we communicate is going to influence who we are communicating with, whether it be their opinion of us or their opinion of the world as a whole. Now, the traits of interpersonal communication. Communication is very dynamic and always changing. It changes from moment to moment, and it changes based on the feedback we get from the people we're talking to. We can be talking to one group of people and the communication is really great, and then we tell the same information to another group and it doesn't work. And the reason why is because there's so many variables, so many independent variables where people are different. And for that reason, how we communicate always is changing. And we should always consider our communication to be interactive. In other words, we always have to be changing with our communication. We can't just set it aside and say, this is how I'm going to say this, and stick to it no matter what happens. No, we have to act on our feedback. And the final thing is, this is hard for some to grasp, is you cannot not communicate. Because when you don't communicate, you're saying something. For instance, if you come home and your child or your spouse refuses to talk to you, they're telling you something. They're telling you that they're mad, maybe they're sad, maybe something went wrong in their day. So by not communicating, they're communicating. If you hop in your car and you drive to the mountains and you refuse to talk to people, you're saying something. So think about that. You cannot not communicate. And then finally, the big thing we really want to touch on, words are free. It's how you use them that may cost you. Yes, you can say anything you want. But when you abuse that and when you hurt people's feelings and you cause turmoil, they might decide to no longer communicate with you. They may decide that the relationship isn't working and they're going to leave. Basically, you can say anything you want to someone, but you cannot control how they respond. So you have to put value into your words. So from here, go ahead and take a break. Take 10, 15 minutes, whatever you need, and then come back and watch part 2. And in part 2, we'll expand on more information as we go through this first chapter of the book.